All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. It's 12 noon, so we're in the afternoon. Happy Monday to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is our last and final brown bag of the year. So thank you so much for being here with us today. My name is Frances Rodriguez. I am the Senior Program Coordinator for the Commute Solutions Program in the TDM Department in Transportation. I'm so happy to be here with you guys today, and I'm really excited to share with you all who our presenters are for today. Today's presentation is going to be provided by Street Light Data, and it is going to talk about equity in transportation, a very hot topic, a very known topic, very present and relative topic. So very excited that you are here for this presentation. Today's presenters are going to be Matt Barkley and Jim Hubble as well. So Mr. Barkley's professional experience includes over 23 years of conducting and managing transportation projects and programs. He served as the primary author, task manager, project manager, and program manager for transportation improvement projects that range in the construction value from $1 million to more than $3 billion. He's led a large-scale corridor planning and feasibility studies and preliminary design and environmental projects that include travel demand forecasting and micro simulation modeling. He managed several contracts with the Texas Department of Transportation, including their Houston district. Matt was an early adopter of big data for transportation analysis and was a customer of Street Light Data for many years. Prior to joining the firm in May of 2020, he served on the board of Central Texas Association of Environmental Professionals for several years until relocating to Colorado in 2018. Matt currently resides in Colorado and serves on the Alvarez Citizen Transportation Advisory Council or Committee, sorry. Our next presenter is going to be Jim Hubble, an AICP. He's a solution engineer with Street Light Data, where he helps a wide range of customers leverage the power of big data to solve complex multimodal transportation questions. He believes in the value of performance-based planning and using data to drive smart transportation-related decisions. Prior to joining Streetlight in 2018, he worked for 18 years as a transportation planner in the Mid-America Regional Council Metropolitan Planning Organization of the Greater Kansas City region, where he gained a broad-based experience in the field, and he also serves in Urban Transportation Data and Information Systems Committee of the Transportation Research Board. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our first presenter, Mr. Matt.
Thank you so much, Frances. Well, welcome everybody. It's good to share some time with all of you on a Monday afternoon. If you could please mute your devices unless you are going to speak, it would be much appreciated, and we will go ahead and get started. I am going to kill my video for bandwidth reasons, but you should still be able to hear me. All right. So we've learned a lot about America's more than 50 million essential workers during the last year and a half of the pandemic, but we still really don't know a lot about a lot of different people's travel needs. And filling in this gap is really critical to bridge the gap if we're going to be able to help people get where they need to go and support rebuilding our faltering economy. In many cities, transit availability, for example, was greatly reduced because of lockdowns, restrictions, because people frankly didn't want to be in crowded situations. There were social distancing requirements, budget issues that sprung from this, but really limiting transit access posed some serious equity concerns for people's ability to access work, medical services, school, and whatever other things that are important to different people in the Houston area. So really, how can we optimize mobility via transit and other options for our essential workforce, for people who have traditionally been underserved in areas where we've underinvested, quite frankly, in transportation? Well, we are part of Street Light Data. We use big data And we're learning how to apply the use of big data to really shed some light on this important topic. So we're super excited to be here. So again, I'm Matt Barkley. Francis, I appreciate your kind words on my bio there at the beginning. It makes me sound far more important than I am. I promise you that. But anyway, I'm the director of the Central Region for Streetlight Data. Really excited to be here, be part of the team. As Francis said, I worked as a consultant in the transportation industry for about 23 years before I joined Streetlight a year and a half ago. I was introduced to Streetlight as a customer and completed many projects using Streetlight metrics through project work. And I want to tell you about one of those projects, which was actually the very first one that I saw because it relates to the topic at hand here. It was a traffic engineering campus circulation study. And while that doesn't sound equity driven, I think you'll hear that it really is getting at the heart of some of the issues that we face in this space. So we did this campus circulation study for the city of Oxford and the University of Miami, which is a small university in the city of Oxford, which is in the state of Ohio. And like so many college towns, the University of Miami is a very large traffic generator in that city. So the study looked at traffic on the arterials that connect the city and the campus, looked at various intersections adjacent to the campus, and then also delved into the active transportation modes, the bicyclist and pedestrian movements on and around campus. So the work that Streetlight did for us at the time was done as a custom project because it predated what we call our multi-mode offering, but they had the data, they were able to process it and deliver it to us nonetheless. And when I saw the data and how it informed this particular study, and really more importantly, the outcome of this particular study, I was totally blown away. And you're going to hear the word outcome quite frequently today as we talk through this, because from an equity perspective, I think that's where we're all trying to get to. We need better outcomes. We don't need better studies. Well, we do need better studies, but ultimately we need those studies to produce better outcomes and really provide alternatives for people who need different ways to get around other than just using a car. So at the time, there was no other source for the kind of data that we got from Streetlight other than perhaps the costly and rather onerous, time-consuming traveler surveys. But this project was a quick burn in terms of the schedule, and we did not have a lot of money to fund a traveler survey. So we turned to big data. And that data was really helpful. Like I said, when we saw we could hone in on specific arterials and intersections that were frequently being used by bicyclists, pedestrians, and then we were able to offer engineering solutions for those intersections to really improve throughput of vehicles, but to also make them more conducive to bicyclists, pedestrians, and reduce potential for conflicts between all of the modes. And using the data, we were able to make some very simple but very effective recommendations with respect to things like reducing dwell times at some bus stops and changing in parking from anyone to just faculty and staff, adding in some road diet options like bump outs, raised medians, and then changing some enforcement actions with respect to pickups and drop-offs of students and where and when that could happen. And then some, one more complicated thing, which involved the closure of a through street, which was one of the more challenging aspects of the project. But in any case, the study produced real changes that definitely save lives, reduce congestion, and give people who aren't driving, like students on a college campus, different options for getting around. And big data was an integral part of that. So that's a little bit about myself. And Jim can introduce himself when he's going to give a demonstration when we get to that point, and he can introduce himself as he cues that up, provide a little more insight on his background and his experience in the transportation space, specifically as it relates to equity. So thanks again for your time today. Let's get started thinking about equity and specifically about how we might do things differently moving forward to promote and really realize positive changes in terms of improving access to transportation, particularly for people who might not have a car or don't have full-time access a car or can't drive a car. I think about growing up. I grew up in a very rural part of Appalachia, and my grandmother did not ever drive a vehicle. She lived 99 years without a driver's license. And there are people like that are out there. That's in the rural environment, which is a very different set of challenges than we face in an urban one. But nevertheless, the need for alternative means of getting around to places we all need to get to is a recurring theme. So here's our agenda. We're going to cover some of the challenges with respect to traditional data collection, how big data can help us overcome some of those challenges. And then I'll cover a couple of kind of real life or real world examples of how some of our colleagues in the transportation industry use big data to better understand equity and, more importantly, to change those outcomes that I mentioned earlier for people that are traditionally underserved, who again need some alternatives for being able to move from their homes to their jobs, to their schools, to medical facilities, to grocery stores, to recreation opportunities. And what we're gonna focus on a little bit today is the old management adage that is, what gets measured gets done. And then lastly, Jim's going to open up the platform and give you some examples. If you were using a streetlight big data technology product, for example, how you can go about measuring different variables that are critically important to understanding things through the lens or through the equity lens. So what are some of the challenges that we face using traditional data collection means and methods? Anyone have any ideas out there? So if you see on this slide, we've got the title, Why Data Representativeness is Important. And a lot of us, including myself and Jim, come from a planning background. So we're really catching a lot of these things early on. We can be a little less detailed and more strategic, but it really does set the foundation for all the phases of project development downstream of planning. So if we don't get planning right, it becomes increasingly difficult to get the latter phases of project development correct and to really produce those outcomes that we need, and those outcomes that we need to be different than they've been historically speaking. So if you look around, you move around outside, you travel, it's not hard to see that we probably need to do things a little bit differently. Our traditional methods got us to this point. We see a lot of unintended consequences from decades of kind of business as usual. Unfortunately, we've seen certain populations that have been marginalized, whether they're reluctant to participate or not getting their voices heard in the process. Whatever the case may be, the end result is that there are many people that are underrepresented in the planning process, and fast forward, really don't benefit to the same degree as others from investments and ultimately outcomes in transportation. But we're getting better. At least now we can acknowledge that there's a need for work in this space. And as Francis said in the opening there, it's a hot topic, and it's taken a long time to get there, but we're there, and it's an important one. So representation is absolutely critical. How do we better represent those that have been historically underrepresented? How do we better understand the needs of people, which vary by demographics, by location? We need to break the cycle that you see here on the screen. Our data collection efforts need to eliminate bias to the maximum extent practicable. We need to represent all users of the transportation system, not just people in cars on roads, although that is foundational to the understanding of transportation because it is our primary means of getting around as a society. We need to understand the nuanced transportation needs of people living in the inner city, as well as those living in very rural parts of the area and everything in between. And each of those groups and locations have differing needs. And finally, when we understand their needs through better data collection and analysis, how do we actually do something about it to change the outcomes? You can see outcomes in the photos on this slide. One includes a variety of alternatives. You can see people walking, a bicycle, light rail on roads, etc. And that in sharp contrast with the two people that look like they're going to fall off the sidewalk into the 6 or 8 lane urban arterial section to their right there on the street, which is not a great place to be walking. There's uncontrolled access, so you need to cross driveways, and that creates a hazard for pedestrians and drivers alike. And you can see this play out in any urban area really around the country, and I'm certain some of you see it in different parts of Houston. And that's just in an urban setting. Rural communities, as I mentioned earlier with my grandmother, they face a very differing set of challenges, but challenges nonetheless, particularly when it comes to transportation. The trips are longer, they take more time, there are a few people making those trips, the destinations tend to differ, so that's challenging even for the best of us in the planning space. Let's go one more forward, Jim. So be it good, bad, or indifferent, we really live in a world where everything that moves pretty much is generating some kind of data these days. We collect data from smartphones, connected cars, connected trucks, road sensors, traffic lights, smart pads, all of it. That data, which you see, makes some pretty interesting content for a presentation, but really requires more work to actually be useful for this particular problem set. And that's where companies like Streetlight Data can help. We combine mobile data with lots of other data, and then our machine learning and data science turns it into rich, actionable transportation analytics and metrics that professionals can access via a cloud-based product. There are a lot of other technology companies working in the big data space. Each of them have their own approach. Each of them have their unique product offerings. And truthfully, it's going to take a village for us to solve this problem and get to those better outcomes that I've mentioned. So it's great to see a lot of work in the space of technology, and it's fun and exciting to be part of that. So in just a few clicks using our product, you can pull accurate transportation analytics about nearly any transportation behavior, anywhere for any mode. And the ability to look at multiple modes and trip characteristics has really never been more important than it is today, and really never been more important for solving this equity challenge that we're facing. For example, you can understand origin destination in your area. That was an important part of the study that I mentioned during my introduction. We can understand where people come from, go to, and as basic as it gets, it's very important and very hard to figure out through things like household travel surveys how that's actually occurring. You can also understand at the block group level, for example, demographics of people making trips, characteristics of those trips, how many trips are being made, how long are they, where are the most common destinations, are they ending to change modes, or are they continuing their travels, or are they ending at work, school, grocery store, community center, a park. These are all really important questions to ask and answer. And using big data and working with companies like Streetlight, we can help you do that. So I mentioned travel surveys, and these are tried and true instruments that provide agencies like HGAC with useful information about the profile of residents, the usage of roadways, facilities, services. There's no question about the need to continue to use them and look for ways to increase their effectiveness. But there's opportunities to use more robust data sets like big data to complement and really augment these traditional survey instruments to ensure that more people are able to respond and that we're hearing from the broadest, most diverse group possible. When discussing big data during this presentation, we are specifically speaking about passive collection or location-based services data that originates from smart devices. It's really from the apps of smart devices to gather information about group travel behavior. You can think of this location-based services data, or LBS data as we call it, as highly precise, anonymous, geolocated, kind of a trail of breadcrumbs that are collected when you give your device permission to collect your location on your smartphone. You might be trying to find a gas station, looking up the weather, using a dating app. All of these applications ask for location, and if you give them permission, they collect it, and then that's where technology comes in to turn that into transportation metrics. These devices are essentially probes that are collecting trip data like a travel diary throughout the course of the day. And LBS data provides a massive sample of data. Over 80% of American adults own smart devices and rely on their devices for internet use as well. Ownership is high among different demographic groups, as seen here from the survey conducted by Pew. And it's important to note that LBS data does not rely on a mobile carrier, so the coverage is high in both urban, rural, or suburban, and all the areas of transition in between. Next slide, Jim. So if you look kind of closely at these charts, you're going to see two things. First, the challenge with travel surveys, it's low participation. You all know that. You've, I'm sure, been part of that in the past. Less than 1% at best. And then we see kind of some of the outcomes from that around us. And this is no fault of anyone doing the surveys. This is just the nature of the process and how they're done. This is one contributing factor. And it's an early one in planning, again, and I mentioned earlier, where downstream effects are really magnified kind of as we move through project development from planning into design, construction, and ultimately implementation. The second thing you're going to notice here is the average penetration rate specific to LBS data across income groups, which is what we're showing, is orders of magnitude better in terms of sample size and representativeness. And that's something that's going to continue to get better each day. And I mentioned earlier, again, I'm not suggesting we do away with travel surveys. We need to continue to use them. But what I am suggesting is we now have much better tools and technology to augment and supplement those surveys with a much larger, diverse, and more robust data set. Next slide, Jim. So you may be asking yourself, how are we able to normalize to ensure representation across demographics like income, for example? We get this question a lot. There's a kind of this feeling out there that smartphone device ownership is not ubiquitous across the population, that perhaps lower income people may not use them. And we've just found through our work as well as third-party work done by others like Pew that is just simply not the case. And then there's the question of accuracy of data for equity applications. There's really no way to ground truth the big data. I guess in concert with the surveys, you have two different data sets done through two different analytical methods, and that does help a lot. And that's why we here at Streetlight spend a lot of time and effort on validating all the metrics that we provide. And again, that's why we see synergy when we combine the old school tried and true travel survey approach with validated metrics that are derived from big data. So let's get a little bit more specific about equity analysis using the Streetlight data insight platform. And we're here to talk about Streetlight, but there, as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of people that work in the big data transportation space, and there are pros and cons to each. And again, the more tools that are available, the more helpful I think it is to solving this problem. So we know essential workers are often socially or economically disadvantaged. A recent study found essential workers on average make less than non-essential workers, no surprise, with a median hourly wage of just a little more than $13. Essential workers in the food and agricultural industry, for example, earn the least. Nearly 70% of essential workers do not have a college degree. So very different group of people. We wanted to learn more about how transit systems serve disadvantaged residents. And we decided to analyze Richmond, Virginia during the state's first lockdown, which was from April 1st to May 31st in 2020. We chose Richmond because that's where one of our 3 offices is. And it's a community where a lot of our employees live, and it's not a super large city. So people are pretty familiar, our folks are familiar with the lay of the land there. So it was a good choice for us to evaluate the data. Next one, Jim. So where, when, and why are these communities traveling? Well, we analyzed the time of day transit distribution, and it showed that the OD pairs peak from midday to late evening, with fewer trips during the peak AM hours. Trips between the neighborhood we looked at, Gilpin Court, and essential businesses don't necessarily follow peak periods, with a higher number of trips occurring during the AM and PM peak. So different travel patterns. Anecdotally, we did see a lot of this shift in the peak AM and PM over the United States, but this particular one was a little bit different in Gilpin Court. Next slide, Jim. So we analyzed typical weekdays in April and May 2020 to understand the top destinations for trips that started in the Gilpin Court neighborhood. Top destination for the neighborhood is a block group where 2 essential businesses are located. One of them is a grocery store, the other one is a hardware store. And if you reflect back early on during the COVID restrictions, those were 2 places that people were definitely frequenting: groceries, and for the home improvers out there, the hardware stores. There are also a lot of corner markets located in Gilpin Court, but the grocery store was the closest full service one to the community. And while they may look close, the block groups are about 1.5 miles away, and that's an estimated 30-minute walk or a 5-minute drive. And quite truthfully, the highways also limit mobility by making walking and biking more difficult. Sound familiar to anybody? The distance would be especially difficult if a person is carrying a week's or even a few days worth of groceries. Depending on what it is, can be quite challenging and quite heavy, and it can also be quite warm and humid in Richmond. So there are a lot of things to consider. Currently, transit service runs through Gilpin Court. It runs north-south. Looking at the top destinations for trips originating in Gilpin Court, we see that many of these trips are covered by the north-south service. There are multiple overlapping transit routes in this area that provide 15-minute frequency of transit service throughout most service hours. However, transferring to another route is required to reach each of the essential businesses that I mentioned earlier. So this increases travel time, but it also increased potential exposure to COVID-19. When you're out there moving about around other people, that's kind of what happens. Next slide, Jim. So this was an interesting study. It was done by Jacobs, who is a very large consulting firm in the AEC space, where they were working up in Oregon and in the Tualatin Hills Park and Recreation District. That district secured some funding to build a pedestrian and bicycle bridge crossing US Highway 26. Since the traditional Portland metro area model did not provide enough detail about pedestrian and bicycle activity, especially if you kind of think about how you could cross-tabulate that with something like income or ethnicity, the rec district asked Jacobs to help them. So Jacobs used Streetlight and were able to look at bike ped activity in the area and specifically how it differed by income and race. Were there short trips that could easily be shifted from vehicles to one of the active modes, for example? And it's surprising how often that occurs. I remember back when I was living in Texas and we were studying Interstate 35, specifically in downtown Austin, and we were expecting to see a very high percentage of through trips, which we did. But when we started looking at the data more granularly, you begin to understand very quickly that there are many, many trips that are even occurring on an interstate like I-35 that are less than 2 miles, for example. And they're using it almost as a way to navigate downtown and get around some of the congestion. So there's a lot of short trips out there, and understanding where they're concentrated might give us a better idea of how we get those shorter trips out of the vehicles and onto another mode. And in this case, they were able to show many of those short trips were favorable for mode shift potential, and that in fact, if they did build this new bridge, it would accommodate many of those shorter trips and in theory get people out of their single occupancy vehicles into the active modes, and actually would benefit low income and minority communities that often have a very different transportation need than other people. Next slide, Jim. And then my last example here is from the city of Pittsburgh, where they were looking at equity. Specifically, they were trying to figure out and deploy a variety of initiatives to make Pittsburgh a safer place to walk or ride a bicycle. But like so many cities, they have a lot of challenges. If you've ever been to Pittsburgh, it's very hilly there. There are 3 rivers that run through the city, so there are lots of topographical environmental barriers by nature. There's not a lot of space. It's a heavily developed urbanized area. There's demand for on-street parking. All these same things that we deal with around the country, and lots of unusual roadway geometry. These city systems developed over time, and when they were built, the population looked one way. Fast forward 50 years, things are different. So lots and lots of challenges. The team in this case had good vehicle data, but they didn't have information about the active modes, and they needed that information to really hone in on where were they seeing crashes, for example. So using Streetlight data's bike and pedestrian origin destination metrics, they were able to understand this travel behavior, trip assignments, mode choice in a new and more data-driven way. And the metrics were used to analyze the bike ped activity. That was overlaid with things like census and crash data. And that gave some pretty unexpected insights into where crashes were occurring, where the most severe crashes occurred. And it was happening in areas, interestingly, with lower and bike pedestrian traffic. So this particular case really did improve the importance of having real world travel data to verify anecdotal claims and assumptions. One thing that I will tell you that Jim and I both see every day in the space is that people come into analyses with almost preconceived notions of what they think and how the data should play out. But oftentimes when we look at big data, it tells a different story. And I think that different story is something it's worth thinking about in many cases. We need to be critical of the story, but we also need to understand that what the data-driven story that we're reading might mean something, and it might actually mean that we need to change how we're doing things. So next slide, Jim. With that, we've covered some basics. We've looked at a few different examples about how big data is being used in this equity space. So with that, we're going to take a little bit deeper dive into how you could accomplish these things using the technology that we here at Streetlight have through our online platform. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim.
All right, thanks, Matt. Get switched over to the browser here real quick. And Matt, I might just ask you to confirm that, that you are seeing my Chrome browser.
It is up, Jim.
All right. So just to reiterate, thank you to Francis and the team at HGAC for inviting us to speak today. Hopefully it has come through in Matt's presentation, but I'll just kind of drive home the point that this is definitely a subject that both Matt and I are interested in and quite passionate about. Given our backgrounds in transportation planning, it's something we've been interested in for a long time. As Matt mentioned, I'll maybe just add a little bit to the introduction that Francis shared early on. As she mentioned, I do come from an MPO planning background, nearly 20 years at the MPO for the Kansas City region, which is a bi-state area. And in my role there, I was the transportation performance management team lead, which just basically meant I was the, in the sort of data and analytics section, the group that was responsible for developing forecasts, but also doing any sort of kind of performance measures and performance related analysis. So, but yeah, some, social equity, really, I guess my first introduction to it was through, environmental justice requirements for metropolitan transportation planning, but it's just something having an urban planning background that I've always been strongly interested in. And really at this stage, we would love more than anything to also get folks on the Zoom call engaged. So at any point, if anyone has any questions, I would probably think the best way to do that is enter it in the chat, and either Matt or I will address those as we go through. Also, maybe Francis, you could help call out anything that you're seeing in there if Matt or I happen to miss something. But really, what I wanted to do now is just give some more localized examples in the Houston region. Because while it's interesting, of course, to always hear about what people are doing in other places, I think it's always more engaging and gets people's thoughts going more to focus in on the region where folks are located. So this is this is just a set of sort of pre-run queries or analyses. So really, what the Streetlight Insight platform does is it's an environment where it's a software as a service environment where people can go to analyze mode classified trips in a variety of different ways to get metrics that are meaningful. And with Streetlight Insight, but also I'd just say with big data more generally, it is possible to derive a whole host of metrics that support equity analyses or social equity focused analyses. But I always like to say, like, metrics or the data that comes out of it, those are just the ingredients. I'm always really impressed with the way people take those metrics and interpret them sort of spatial, temporally to gain really interesting insights. And as with any analysis, it's important to apply rigorous testing and professional judgment in order to reach sound and defensible interpretations. Ultimately, good recommendations are based on multiple data points, and insight can fill in several gaps. As Matt has mentioned, we're seeing this as big data is additive. It's not necessarily going to wholesale replace anything, at least not at this stage yet. But it can add a lot of value, can fill in a lot of gaps, and it can provide more data points and bring in more perspective. And I'm going to share a few examples in the Houston region that are viewed through more of an equity lens. So without further ado, so I'll briefly set the context of what you're looking at here, and then kind of dive into how I think some of the metrics can support equity analyses. So when Frances and I had spoken in preparation for this meeting, she mentioned that there is a study currently underway, the Southeast Harris County Subregional Study, looking at areas kind of in the south and east of Houston proper, also South Houston, Pasadena, and a few other jurisdictions in this area over by State Route 225. And so I thought one interesting way to start would just be kind of highlighting how big data can support very detailed, localized, and current information on trips. In this case, we'll focus on vehicular travel. And not just things like volumes and speeds, which could certainly be used to analyze, but deeper information about the travel itself, like the trip lengths, when the travel is occurring, where it's coming from, where it's going to, but also, and I think is most important for equity analysis, are the people that are traveling. So I'm going to just highlight that by clicking on a couple of different segments here. So these yellow segments you see here, basically I said, all right, let's grab a few segments on State Highway 225, a few segments on I-45, but then also like an arterial located in this general study area, Allendale Road, and see how big data can really focus in on like the differences in the nature of travel that's occurring on those different facilities. So right off the bat, I'm just going to filter it to the westbound portion of 225. So of course, you can look at things like how is the, how is travel, how are volumes, changing throughout time of day. What are the origins and destinations of those trips, et cetera. But also, you can get information about the trips themselves. So I'll just pop this out real quick. I'm not going to go through anything in painstaking detail, but to understand, like on our freeway facility, and this is probably what we'd expect, and you look at the distribution of the trip lengths. This is just sort of on a typical day in 2019, pre-pandemic. A lot of the trips are longer distance trips. In fact, there's not an insignificant percentage that are traveling over 100 miles from origin to destination. So this is it confirms that this is a regional facility. It's getting people to and from their jobs or other services and activities they need to access. But it's the nature of travel on this road is unique to the facility. And just real quick, I'll contrast that with now I'm basically turning off the freeway and turning on the statistics for the analysis on Allendale Road. Very different. I coming from somebody that focused a lot on functional classification at the MPO and maintaining that map. I look at this and say, this is serving a lot of shorter trips, likely trips that are sort of localized to the study area, and either that or they're filtering up to get to the highways to then take people to their their more far-flung destinations. But then trying to view this through more of an equity lens, there's also information about the people making the trips themselves, and this is the one that I think provides a really stark contrast. Again, I'm actually going to go back to the we'll take the State Highway 225 segment, and more, and of course this is going to be known better by folks on the call, but more likely, the very diverse type of travel going on a freeway is going to probably more closely resemble like demographic characteristics of the region as a whole, because it's just a big mix of people, probably even people that are not from the region traveling on this road. But let's go down to the racial information. And by the way, this is just pulled from the quick elevator speech of how this is derived, especially from data that comes to us anonymized, is location-based services data, these are devices, so they're attached to people. People have daily patterns, but especially they spend certain periods of time at work during the day most often, at home during the evening most often. So we can infer the home locations of the devices. And essentially what we do then is we just look at the block group where the device lives, and we attach the distribution for different demographics based on ACS data to that device. But here, you see a different demographic, kind of racial and ethnicity, either Hispanic, non-Hispanic breakdown for the travel that's occurring on State Highway 225 versus Allendale Road, which again, we're sort of assuming is more kind of localized traffic. So if I flip over to that, you see it's predominantly Hispanic population, which reflects, if my understanding is correct, the demographics of sort of the Southeast Harris County. Now I'm going to flip to something I think really drives the point home. I also think this is a good sort of reasonableness check on the metrics that are attached to this data in general. So again, you just notice by now, oops, I'm gonna sort of toggle a lot back and forth between the State Highway 225 and the Allendale Road. So now, again, focusing on only travel that occurred on this segment of 225. And this is where I think big data and its ability to kind of understand where the devices live is a huge game changer for equity analysis. So what I've just done is I've said, turn on the home location grid. So basically show me where the people live that travel on this freeway on a typical day, 2019. And not surprisingly, it's people from all over the Houston region. This is a regional facility. It's multi jurisdictional in nature, and while there definitely are large numbers of people, this is particularly looking at the westbound direction, coming from those communities located to the east. This is definitely a regional facility in nature. Contrast that, and so I'm thinking improvements or changes to this highway are going to impact a very different group of people than, for example, now if we focus it in on Allendale, the sort of travel market, again, this is focusing on home locations, not necessarily origin of the trip, although in certain time periods, I'd say, the origin of the trip is most likely to be home, especially like peak AM. But these are the home locations of people driving on Allendale. Much less regional in nature. Still, people from different areas of the Houston metro are driving on this, but a very different, set of circumstances when you're, discussing kind of public engagement strategy, but also really trying to understand who's impacted by some sort of a change or, ideally improvement to this road. All right, moving on, and please, again, anybody with any questions, feel free to pop those into the chat, and then Matt or Francis, if you'd read those off.
Sure.
Especially if they're...
I was just going to make a quick comment about that, Jim. And this is, again, what I mentioned when I was talking earlier about how you might get some synergy between something like a travel survey or, as you mentioned, Jim, public engagement. And if you're looking at a project, specifically, if you were looking at a project on the section of Allendale that Jim has up, you could quickly see where to focus your engagement or your travel survey efforts, because you now understand where the people live that are actually using this particular segment of Allendale Road. And that becomes a very illuminating data point that we really, as an industry, as simple as it sounds, we just haven't had access to this kind of information. And now we do, so we can get much more targeted on who we are reaching out to specifically, which I think helps us be more representative very early in the planning process.
Agreed. Yeah, I mean, when I first saw these, the first thing that came to mind was NEPA. Like, this is just such a game changer for a NEPA study, to where in my experience, and no shade being thrown at any of the planners or the consultants that were involved in studies in the Kansas City region, but the typical approach on a NEPA study was to draw maybe a half-mile buffer around the corridor being studied and say that's our public engagement boundary. And you can see by looking at things like this that leverage home locations for literally thousands, millions of devices, it's a much different story than that. And there's a way to leverage big data, to target better public outreach and really include the populations that are going to be impacted. All right. So I really just have a couple other examples still in the same general area, although I'm going to move up here more into the, I think, sort of the Pasadena area and talk about something. Just pop over to this next example. So, speeds analysis, as mentioned before. And this is something that I think is also interesting because while there are definitely, we take it very seriously. Like if we're going to be recommending people leverage big data, it needs to be representative. And that's why, streetlight data and the slides that Matt showed earlier, we're constantly checking to make sure, like, do we have a good representation across different demographic groups, just even spatially across, urban, suburban, exurban, rural areas. There are some metrics, though, that I will say it aren't so, where that's not as critical. So like speed, for example, if you have enough travel time runs on a particular roadway, you can kind of assume that that is representative of what's happening just in terms of speed on a roadway, kind of regardless of the source of that data, because really all traffic is sort of confined to a given segment of roadway, and ultimately things like speed metrics are are going to sort of even out as long as you've got enough sample. They're going to be truly representative, and so and I imagine that people on this call, definitely people at HGAC, have worked with probe-based speed data before. It was coming from somebody that started at a time where we would go out and do floating car travel time runs, that when GPS data became available, that was quite the the blessing to be able to stay in the office and just analyze data, which much larger sample representation to understand things like speeds and travel times on roads. So in the transportation planning industry, I would say LBS data, the location-based services, they can fill in gaps on local streets, because a lot of the early probe data products really focused on things like freeways and higher level arterials. Speeds and volumes obviously have a relationship to safety. And a lot of work in our industry is focused on reducing congestion and maintaining high speeds effectively. But when you get down to sort of the street level, high speeds can actually be a safety issue. And so that's why I've actually, often you'll see places with low congestion on one of these kind of heat maps shown as green, and the congested facilities are shown as red. But I've sort of flipped it here to show, high speeds can actually be a safety issue anywhere, regardless of what level of sort of advantage or disadvantage a neighborhood has. But in places where maybe there are higher numbers of zero vehicle households, we need to pay extra special attention to pedestrian and bicyclist safety. And so this here is just looking at all the roadway segments in this kind of swath here, just located to the south of 225. And I'm going to ask people to take sort of a mental picture of this, because I think, again, ingredients to the analysis is what essentially we're deriving here. So here you can see Scarborough, Shaver, let's see, Main Street, the arterials mostly are those routes with higher speeds, although you definitely along here on Eagle Avenue seeing some kind of higher than what might be expected for more localized streets. This is just looking at kind of average speeds across a full day. This could be, of course, drilled down to late night or peak periods. But here you can kind of see, like, what are those roads that have higher speeds that could be, I think the guideline is anything over 20 miles per hour can be very dangerous when there's a vehicular and pedestrian collision. So if we flip now to understanding pedestrian, because again, big data now has the ability to really kind of measure all modes simultaneously, and that's a goal of streetlight data. This now is the same set of roadways, but it's showing the pedestrian volume on those roadways. And so, here along, I guess Ritchie Street, showing there was definitely kind of higher than normal speeds there. But here, definitely at near the intersection of Harris and Ritchie, you're seeing quite a bit of pedestrian activity, and somewhere where obviously the likelihood, the potential for pedestrian car collisions is going to be higher than maybe in some other areas. Let's see. Oh, we got the 5-minute warning. Well, that actually really does. I was going to plan to kind of stop the presentation of at least the demonstration there and open it up to questions or discussions, and would certainly invite even just thoughts and feedback on what others are thinking. What are some data gaps, and maybe we could talk for a bit about how big data can fill in some of those gaps. All right. Let me expand that window, read this question, so that everybody doesn't need to read. I'll read off the question. So many uses, understanding where people work who use a particular facility is helpful for transportation demand management. I agree, especially to manage construction-based congestion. Yes, I completely agree, and I'm glad, Jamila, that you also feel this way. So to Reddy's question, can you walk us through again on how you derived income race information from probe data? Yes, because I know I sort of went over that quickly. So and I imagine that different big data providers have their own sort of proprietary methods for how they go about it. But the way we do it at Streetlight is, so first, so we take these location-based services, essentially these usable devices in our data set. They're anonymous. All we know is there is a device ID that's hashed, but it does persist. So it's a unique device ID that at least sort of month to month, which is where we kind of get our data in 1 month batches, they persist. And so we have methods where we will actually identify the most probable home and work locations based on the sort of diurnal patterns of the devices, and then we will tag them to a and I'll start touching on the privacy issue here too. So it's not tagged. It's not possible to re-identify individuals, but we'll tag it to a general location, basically a neighborhood where the device lives, not a parcel. But then by knowing the neighborhood, i.e. the block group where the device lives, we can take, and focusing specifically on the home location, it will actually then just be given the distribution for different demographic characteristics. So we'll take the income, so that using ACS data, that block group has a certain income distribution. So any device that lives in that block group just carries that distribution with it. So in the aggregate, then those those distributions are integrated together to derive sort of a profile for the devices that are biking on a certain trail or walking on a certain street or driving on a certain freeway. And I mean that with getting down to that it does start to get into privacy questions, which is why we're sort of privacy protected at multiple levels. Like Streetlight Data has a whole team focused on privacy. They monitor privacy law. We actually work only with vendors that are compliant with sort of standard practice within the privacy space. In other words, we're actually kind of making the assumption that GDPR, the European Union's privacy laws, are eventually going to be adopted in North America. And so we are basically holding our data providers to those standards. And then also on the sort of on the analysis side, on the aggregation side here, we have privacy checks within our application that will, that will prohibit the re-identification of individuals. So everything's just going to be shown in the aggregate. Let's see. Capability to use data to change public outreach methods. A specific example of how this has been done. Good question. I know we've just got 1 minute left. Matt, I may also ask you to weigh in on this. Do we have any published case examples of how it informed the public involvement process?
We don't have any published ones that I can think of off the top of my head, Jim, but I can say from my own personal experience, we were doing a study out near Texas A&M, and we were looking at a couple different relief routes around some small communities out there, and they were on state highways, as is often the case in Texas and a lot of other places. Frankly, the state highway serves as a main street in a small community. And so there's this push-pull of, do we take the traffic outside of the community? Will that kill it? Or people coming there because it's their destination? And so we were able to use those home metrics to see what is the travel shed for that community from the perspective of people that are actually driving on the existing facility. And then we targeted those people specifically during the public engagement to try to get at the input from people actually using the roadway, not from other vocal minority groups that so often participate in these things. So that was one. I mean, it's a straight up highway project, but it was one case where we definitely used the metrics to help us tailor the public involvement strategy for the NEPA study on that particular project.
All right. I think that covers all the questions. Thank you everyone for the engagement. And everybody remember the Commute Solutions Month Virtual Transportation Fair on September 30th.
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. Yes, this is Commute Solutions Month, everyone. So if you haven't tried an alternative mode of commuting and you're currently commuting to work, please think about just trying it once, see how it works for you. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or any of the other Commute Solution team members. We're very happy to help you find an alternative mode of commute that would work perfectly for you. Matt and Jim, I want to thank you both for being here with us today and sharing your presentation. This meeting is recorded, so if anyone has any questions or if you would like to go back and take another look, please feel free to go back and watch this presentation again. If anyone missed it, it's available, so you can forward it or share this presentation with any of your colleagues. At this time, I'd like to wrap up our final brown bag presentation for the year. Thank you all very much for joining us. I hope you all have a great Monday. Have the great rest of the week, guys.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.